Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Dr. Eric Fung. He's the Vice President of Clinical Development at Grail Bio. Here's a bit about his bio. He's an executive with experience in IVD test development, including biomarker and discovery and validation, clinical trials, FDA submission, product launch. So sounds like his experience goes through the whole life cycle of ideation to actual approval. And we're going to talk about his work at Grail. So Eric, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. If you would tell me a bit about your background, how did you end up at Grail? And then I want to talk about Grail itself.
Sounds great. So I've always had a long-standing interest in applying technology to clinical questions and clinical issues. And Grail was a natural fit for the progression of my career because I had done quite a bit of work in developing a number of different diagnostic tests using both protein and DNA analysis. And Grail was really transforming medicine and had, in my mind, when I joined about 4 years ago, the opportunity to really change the way we think about cancer detection. And what that really means is, as we all know, early detection of cancer is really the best proposition for survival and bending the mortality curve. Most of what we've been doing over the last, 50 years in the war of cancer has been focusing on therapeutics. And, when we look at many of the therapeutics that have been approved by the FDA, their impact on survival tends to be relatively short. And that's because if we're still detecting cancer at a late stage, we're really not giving ourselves the best opportunity to reduce mortality. And so Grail's mission to detect cancer early really resonated with me. And on the technology side, the concept of looking at cell-free nucleic acid and the circulating DNA that's shed by the cancer cells is really a technological leap from where we have been, where we've been really looking at trying to detect cancer anatomically. And that's really what all of our current screening paradigms really do in general. So mammography looks for a tumor, colonoscopy looks for a tumor, and we now have an opportunity to really utilize a novel technology to look at it molecularly. And so obviously there was a lot of work to be done, and that's really why I wanted to join Grail.
So is this what's known as a liquid biopsy? Taking blood or other body fluids to look for tumor markers?
Yeah, the phrasing of liquid biopsy has been used quite a bit in the field of oncology. The way I think about liquid biopsy in its strictest sense is a test that's utilized in individuals who already have a known diagnosis of cancer. And what we're trying to do is, in that situation, try to assess, for example, what are the mutations in that cancer, and that helps, for example, determine treatment selection. The way that I think about what we're doing at Grail is not really this application, and I would describe it more as multi-cancer early detection, or what we say in shorthand, MCED. testing. And the big distinction here is in multi-cancer early detection, we're trying to detect cancer. So by definition, this is in individuals who we don't know have cancer yet, and we're trying to detect that cancer. And that's really the distinction between what I would describe as conventional liquid biopsy. And the technical challenges and the clinical applications are distinct between MCED testing and liquid biopsies. And so when we think about what we're doing at Grail and developing the MCED test, what we're really trying to do is answer a two-part question. The first question is there a signal of cancer present or not? And the second question is, if there is a cancer signal, where did that cancer most likely arise from? And that's really the clinical application of MCED testing.
So, okay, what's the difference between the MCED testing? What does it look for versus, let's say, a liquid biopsy? What's the difference?
So when we're doing a MCED test, and this is borne out through all the work that's been done over this last several years, we're looking at DNA that's been shed by cancer cells. And so early on, we conducted a study called the Circulating Cell-Free Genome Atlas Study, or CCGA. And we did kind of a bake-off because we know that there are a number of different kinds of genetic aberrations in cancer cells. There are copy number changes in which, there's amplification or deletion of regions of the genome. There's also single nucleotide variants or very specific mutations. There are also epigenetic changes, so changes in the methylation patterns. And so early on, we had to really understand, was it necessary to measure all of these different kinds of aberrations, or was there a subset of types of aberrations that would make it advantageous to answer those two questions I mentioned earlier? Is there a cancer signal? And if so, where did that cancer signal arise from? So in our first sub-study of this CCGA study, we did the bake-off. We ran the exact same samples using 3 different assays, one to interrogate each of these different kinds of aberrations. And while they all had their abilities to detect cancer, what we found about the epigenetic signal approach was that it also allowed us really to answer the second question. That is to say, where is the cancer most likely to have arisen from? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that epigenetics plays a critically important role in cellular differentiation. And so your liver cells are different from your cardiac cells, are different from your brain cells. And a lot of that has to do with epigenetic regulation. And we can actually leverage that to help us answer that two-part question. So it's really based off of this early work that we did in the first sub-study of CCGA that led us to focus on looking at methylation signals. Obviously, we progressed the technology quite substantially since then, and now we have achieved a very high performance that we have reported out earlier this year from CCGA and from other studies that demonstrate the value of and the ability of looking at these epigenetic changes or methylation changes to answer those two questions that I described earlier.
Have you done any studies, or has anyone done any studies in a mouse, let's say that's cancer-free, and started doing these analyses, then deliberately, injected it or gave it a bunch of cancer cells and looked for the start of the biomarkers and the progression of them as the mouse goes along and develops the cancer?
Yeah, so there's certainly been a lot of interest in looking at what you might describe as the evolution of cancer genomes. And that's a combination of both molecular and anatomic localization. So in other words, if a cancer starts out in a very specific location, what are its earliest genomic hallmarks? And then as it grows and then as it metastasizes or spreads, how does that metastasis signaling occur? What are the genomic aberrations that continue onward? What we've come to understand, particularly from our work in the development of the multi-cancer early detection test, is that, and this is not just unique to methylation, but that there are a number of different genomic aberrations that occur, obviously, that in cancer cells. And these genomic aberrations can be quite complex. But there are a couple of fundamental tenets that are important and really describe the success of the MCED test. So number one is that there are a number of genomic aberrations, methylation aberrations, that are fairly consistent across a number of different cancer types. And that really helps us answer that first part question of, is there a methylation signal that describes a presence of cancer? The second fundamental tenet is that there are actually some very cell type specific changes that occur that are consistent. And so we get asked, for example, if a cancer spreads to the lung, are our methylation signals more consistent with lung or from where that cancer came from? Because obviously, if the cancer signal that we detect is dominated by where the cancer ends up, we might actually provide a mislocalization information. But in fact, those hallmarks of the original site of the cancer still remain.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
And so we can leverage that. And so even if there's a cancer that is metastasized to the lung, we are able to still be able to determine where that cancer came from. And so those are 2 important characteristics of kind of this evolution of cancer genomes that we have leveraged in the development of our MSET test.
So for particular types of cancers, at what point are the exudates that come off of them unique to the location of that cancer? And at what point does it change? Has anyone figured that out yet?
Yeah, so even the earliest stages of cancer can provide a hallmark of both the presence of cancer as well as where that cancer came from. And that's borne out from our data that we presented earlier this year from CCGA-3, or the 3rd sub-study of CCGA, as well as data that we presented in our prospective study for Pathfinder. And what I mean by that is, as you all know, cancers, particularly solid cancers, tend to progress from a pre-cancerous state to invasive cancer, and that invasive cancer we describe as stages 1, 2, 3, 4. And so we can detect using this methylation approach even stage 1 cancer, and we can in fact determine where that cancer came from even at stage 1. So what that tells us is that the hallmarks, the molecular hallmarks of cancer are present even at that very early stage, and we can detect those as long as there's a high enough shedding rate of those molecular aberrations for us to be able to detect.
How do you know the stage of the cancer that you're working on?
Yeah, so the way that we can determine the stage of a cancer is in our studies, and again, I want to emphasize that this is in our studies, is one of 2 mechanisms, and it really reflects the type of study that we're doing. So in a case control study, which is what CCGA, we're actually collecting samples from individuals who have a known cancer, and so they've undergone clinical workup. And that clinical workup usually is a determination of the stage of that cancer. So we basically have in CCGA a very large, robust biobank and very extensive clinical annotation of both the type of cancer and the stage of cancer based on all the clinical workup that participant has undergone. In a prospective study such as Pathfinder, these are individuals who are not known to have cancer who received the MSET test, and when we return a signal detected result, then that participant undergoes a workup to look for that cancer. And when a cancer is identified, they typically undergo a set of tests to determine the extent of spread of that cancer, i.e. to stage the cancer. And so that's the way that we understand the stage of the cancer that we detected in a prospective study such as Pathfinder. So in both of these situations, usually the staging of the cancer is done either through imaging or through some type of, for example, pathologic evidence.
So what did you, Eric, what did you notice, or what did the technicians notice about, depending on the stage, what was coming off the various tumors that you're looking at? Does it change dramatically, or what events in the life cycle of a tumor change what kind of markers it gives off?
So for us, our focus is on early detection of cancer. So while there may be applications to understanding the specific molecular aberrations that occur as a cancer evolves and goes from stage progression, what's important to us is really the genomic aberrations that occur early on and our ability to detect those aberrations. So yes, in the field, it is known that genomic alterations accumulate as cancers obviously evolve and as they spread. I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important tenets that we have leveraged in the development of our MCED test is that the early genomic alterations present in early stage cancers are detectable, and we can also look at those aberrations to help us understand where the cancer arose from.
What's the path to taking this into the clinic? What needs to be done from here?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, so, we have done an extensive amount of work to develop and validate our Gallery test. And as I mentioned to you earlier, key study was a Circulating Cell-Free Genome Atlas study, in which we were able to demonstrate that we could detect over 50 types of cancers. A second pillar of evidence that has been very critical is our prospective clinical study called Pathfinder, and we presented our interim results at the ASCO meeting in June. So together, these studies have demonstrated the validity of the Gallery test. And so, in fact, Gallery is available today to patients who qualify for the test. It's obviously by prescription only and needs to be prescribed by a physician. Obviously, there's work to be done to continue to build on the evidence that we have generated, but certainly between CCGA3 and Pathfinder, we've been able to demonstrate the validity and safety of the test.
What stage can you calculate that you can see that's not seen currently with testing? How do you back it out? How do you...
Right.
Or again, to what stage do you anticipate you can see back into?
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple important concepts here. So first of all, today we only screen for a handful of cancers. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have USPSTF guideline recommendations for screening for breast cancer, for colorectal cancer, for lung cancer in a very specific high-risk smoking population. Prostate cancer screening is considered to be a sort of a conversation and a personal decision between an individual and their physician. And then we have cervical cancer screening. So there are a vast number, and in fact, the majority of cancers that occur in cancers that we don't screen for. And that's really where the MCED testing and Gallery play a huge role, which is the opportunity to screen for cancers that we don't screen for yet. So when we think about the detection opportunities that MCED testing offers, it's really the opportunity to work synergistically and complementarily with guideline recommended screening. And together, we should be able to detect a substantially larger number of cancers than just using guideline recommended screening alone. And this combination then should, in fact, allow us to decrease the overall mortality from cancer. And so when we think about the 50 types of cancers that we've been able to demonstrate that MCED testing can provide, this is really the benefit. And, we have shown in CCGA3 and we have also shown in Pathfinder that we can detect as early as stage 1 cancer.
Oh, what is considered stage 1? And like right now, how often are cancers diagnosed or discovered at stage 1? Is it very rare?
So you actually hit on a very important point, which is, how often are cancers detected in stage 1? Because we know that for many cancers, survival at stage 1 can exceed 90%. But unfortunately, the majority of cancers are detected in later stage, and only a fraction of cancers are detected in stage 1, particularly for those for which we don't currently have guideline recommended screening. What we can say is that, MCED testing will provide us the opportunity to increase the percentage of cancers that are detected in stage 1. And you asked the question is, what is the definition of stage 1? Staging, of course, is somewhat different from cancer type to cancer type, but stage 1 cancer in general means that the cancer is localized to the organ in which it was developed. And that's critically important because when cancer is localized, the treatment options there are many more treatment options, including generally surgery. And whereas once a cancer is spread, the types of treatment options are more limited and less efficacious.
At what stage is it a tipping point therapeutically where the therapy it's usually a lot less successful and it's a lot harder on the person? Where does that occur?
So if we think about, cancer generally staged as stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, obviously stage 1, where it is localized, is going to have the best prognosis. Stage 4 usually means that there's distant metastasis, meaning that the cancer has spread far beyond, or not far, but has spread beyond the original site at which it was developed. And that's clearly the stage at which the treatment options are more limited, and we're often looking at palliative therapy. We're often looking at survival rates that are, in the teens or even single digits. Each cancer type is somewhat different. They have different levels of aggressiveness. Our therapies, don't work uniformly across all the different kinds of cancers. So as an example, if we think about pancreatic cancer, stage 4 pancreatic cancer survival is very low, whereas we might have a somewhat higher stage 4 survival in other cancers. But generally speaking, we think of stage 4 cancer as really being a challenge, and we walk backwards from there, where obviously stage 1 is where we would like to get people, and then stage 2 and 3 is often cancer type specific in terms of what the survival rates are.
What particular cancers is Grail looking at? I know you can't look at all of them, so which ones in particular are you focusing on and why?
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, which is, what are the types of cancers that we will most benefit from for early detection? And so we think about high mortality cancers, and these are cancers that, you walk down the street and you talk to people and they say, oh yes, I've heard that's a bad cancer. And those are cancers such as ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, esophageal cancer, liver cancers. And those have, we were just talking about it a few moments ago, very poor survival once it's spread beyond its original organ. And so those are where we can derive the most value in terms of early detection. There are other cancers that, we have alternative means for early detection. For example, melanoma, right? Melanoma can be deadly once it's spread, but, a skin screen can be very helpful in identifying melanoma. And so developing a blood test to look for melanoma may be of somewhat less value than just utilizing a skin screen. And then there are other cancers that exist that are tend to be indolent. And when we say they tend to be indolent, it means that they tend to take a very long time to kill a person or to spread. So, we talked a little bit earlier about prostate cancer, and prostate cancer screening was really a big thing 20 years ago using PSA, and that has diminished quite dramatically. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really a conversation between each individual and his physician, largely because we recognize that there are many prostate cancers that are indolent and won't actually kill the individual, that the individual could live with that prostate cancer for many years. So when we think about the types of cancers where Galleri will have the most value, it's really those cancers that we want to detect early, because we know that when we detect that cancer early, we have a better chance of improving the survival from that cancer. So we think about these aggressive cancers, and those are the ones that we have shown, actually, fortunately, that we have good detection capabilities for. And a lot of this reflects that underlying biology, which is to say that underlying biology of aggressiveness is often reflected in the amount of cell-free nucleic acid that's shed into the circulation that we can detect.
So how close are you with a clinical diagnostic that can be used in clinic? How long away is that? What's in the way of you getting there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Galleri is now available by prescription. And so again, a lot of what we're working on now is education, and education is a critical part of any rollout of a novel test, but in particular, this kind of test, which is quite revolutionary. So, we're educating physicians about how to use the test and in what settings they should use the test, how to interpret the test. We obviously have to educate the public and, educate them about obviously the value of screening, the importance of adhering to guideline recommended screening, and also the value of layering on MCED testing to help look for those cancers that are not yet screened for, and how that can help improve mortality. And then, in the long run, there'll be additional data. We have ongoing studies that were aimed to look at, for example, what is the change in the cancer stage based on utilizing the Galleri test. And so, do we show what we call stage shift, which is a reduction in stage 3 and 4 cancer rates. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, what everybody wants to be able to see from a screening test is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a reduction in mortality. And those are obviously very long-term goals.
Eric and Lee, what's the best place for people to learn more about Grail? Where can they go?
Right. So it'd be great to go to our website at www.grail.com. And if people would like to learn more about the Galleri test, they can go to website Galleri. It's GALLERI.com.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Eric, thank you for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
If you like this podcast, Please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.